The dust of Redemption Creek clung to Sarah's skin like a second coat. It was a fine, pervasive grit that settled in the folds of her worn calico dress and tasted like despair on her tongue. The sun, a merciless orb of white fire, beat down on the small, dilapidated storefront that was both her home and the source of her father's ruin. The sign above, O'Connell's General Store, was faded and chipped, a grim monument to a life of perpetual struggle. Sarah O'Connell, at 22, carried the weight of her father's gambling debts on shoulders too slender for such a burden. Her hands, calloused from years of mending fabric and stocking shelves, trembled as she counted the meager day's earnings. It was never enough. Mr. Henderson, the town's banker, had been by again, his face a grim mask of impatience as he delivered his latest threat of foreclosure. The air was thick with the scent of fear and poverty. Her father, Thomas O'Connell, was a shadow of the man he once was. He sat slumped in a worn armchair, the bottle of cheap whiskey his only companion. His eyes, once bright with the hope of a new life in the West, were now clouded with a permanent haze of regret and liquor. "He'll take everything, Sarah," he slurred, his voice thick with self-pity. "He'll take the store, the land. He'll take us." The he Thomas spoke of was Jedediah Thorne. The name alone was enough to silence a noisy saloon and send a shiver down the spine of the most hardened men in the territory. Jedediah Thorne was not a man. He was a legend, a force of nature. He owned the Blackwood Ranch, a spread so vast it was rumored to touch the horizon in every direction. Stories of his ruthless business dealings and a temper as quick as a rattlesnake's strike were whispered in every corner of the saloon. He was a giant of a man, with a face carved from granite and a reputation for being as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. It was this man, this giant, who held their fate in his hands. Thomas, in a final desperate gambit to save the store, had borrowed a significant sum from Jedediah. The interest had compounded, and the debt had become an unbreakable chain around their necks. A knock on the door, sharp and commanding, shattered the afternoon's oppressive silence. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Thomas didn't move, his gaze fixed on the bottom of his empty glass. Sarah knew who it was without opening the door. Mr. Henderson stood on the porch, his suit impeccably clean, in a town where dust was a permanent resident. Behind him, a rider sat motionless on a powerful black stallion. The rider was a mountain of a man, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in deep shadow. A single, gleaming buckle on his belt caught the light. Sarah's blood ran cold. This was not a messenger. This was the man himself. "Mr. Thorne sends his regards, Mr. O'Connell," Henderson said, his voice clipped and formal. He held a thick stack of papers. "He's tired of waiting." Thomas finally stirred, his eyes darting from Henderson to the silent figure on the horse. A terrible, desperate glint of cunning appeared in his whiskey-soaked eyes. He stood, stumbling toward the door. "Wait!" he croaked. "Tell him I have a proposition." Sarah watched in dawning horror as her father led the banker and the imposing figure of Jedediah Thorne inside. The scent of whiskey and stale fear filled the small room. Jedediah's presence was overwhelming. He was even larger than the stories, his shoulders wide enough to block the light from the windows. He moved with a quiet, powerful grace, his gaze sweeping over the store, his dark eyes missing nothing. When they landed on Sarah, she felt as if she were being examined under a microscope. She instinctively took a step back. Thomas's voice, a pathetic whine, filled the silence. "My daughter, Sarah," he said, gesturing vaguely in her direction. "She's a good girl, hard-working. She'd make a fine wife." Jedediah's gaze shifted back to Thomas, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "Get to the point, Thomas," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. She can pay the debt," Thomas stammered. "Not with money, no. But she's a woman of quality. She's smart, can run a household. A good wife is worth more than a few $1,000s. Isn't that right, Mr. Thorne?" Marry my daughter, and the debt is forgotten. All of it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. Her father had just sold her like a piece of furniture, a tool to be used and discarded. Her eyes, filled with tears, met Jedediah's for a fleeting moment. She saw no emotion there, only a cold, calculating stillness. Jedediah said nothing for a long, agonizing moment. He turned his back on them and walked to the window, staring out at the dusty street. Then he spoke, his voice measured and final. "The debt is paid, O'Connell. Have the papers drawn up, Henderson. The wedding will be in a week." He didn't look at Sarah again. He simply turned and walked out, his spurs jangling on the wooden floorboards, a sound that would echo in Sarah's nightmares for weeks to come. He mounted his horse, a dark silhouette against the setting sun, and rode off without a backward glance, leaving Sarah behind to stare at the man who had traded her freedom for his own. The tears finally came, hot and furious, as she looked at her father. He was a stranger to her now, a man who had chosen his own comfort over his daughter's future. The dust of Redemption Creek was no longer just on her skin, it was in her soul. She was no longer Sarah O'Connell, shopkeeper's daughter. She was Jedediah Thorne's intended, a pawn in a game of survival, and her life as she knew it was over. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was a solitary one. Sarah rode in the back of a covered wagon, the dust churning up behind them as they left the miserable familiarity of Redemption Creek. The only company she had was a grizzled, taciturn ranch hand named Silas, whose face was a roadmap of lines and sun damage. He didn't speak, and for that, Sarah was grateful. She had nothing to say. The landscape changed as they traveled west. The scraggly brush of the lowlands gave way to rolling hills and open prairie, and finally to the imposing silhouettes of the towering pines that gave the Blackwood its name. The ranch itself was less of a homestead and more of a small town, a collection of sturdy log cabins, a sprawling bunkhouse, a large barn, and a massive main house, all constructed from the very trees that surrounded them, stood in a neat, organized cluster. A palpable sense of order and quiet power hung in the air. Sarah was led to the main house. It was not the gilded, gaudy mansion she had half expected. Instead, it was a testament to simple, raw functionality. The furniture was solid, made of dark wood and well-worn leather. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its stone hearth blackened with years of use. There was a sense of lived-in history here, but it was a cold history, devoid of the warmth of a family. Jedediah was waiting for her inside. He stood by the fireplace, a massive figure in the cavernous room. The late afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, bathing the room in a golden glow, but it seemed to stop at Jedediah. He was a study in shadows and silence. He wore a simple dark shirt and trousers, his muscular arms folded across his broad chest. His face, rugged and weathered, gave nothing away. "You're here," he said, his voice the same low, resonant rumble as before. It was not a question. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes, sir." He didn't flinch at her subservient tone. He simply nodded toward a closed door. "That's your room. You'll find a few things in there. We'll be eating at 7. The cook, Clara, will show you the way." And that was it. No grand pronouncements, no declarations of ownership, no cruelty. Just a statement of fact, a set of instructions. Sarah's anxiety, wound so tight it felt like a physical ache, slowly began to loosen. This man, the feared Jedediah Thorne, was not what she had imagined. Or perhaps the true cruelty was a cold indifference, a refusal to acknowledge her existence beyond a simple transaction. She walked to the door and opened it. The room was not what she had expected. It was spacious and clean, with a large, comfortable-looking bed draped in a simple quilt. A small table with a lamp sat in a corner, and a window looked out over the vast, empty prairie. the dying light painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. There was even a small chest of drawers, and inside she found several new dresses, practical and durable, but not the finery she would have expected of a wealthy man's wife. It was all a strange mix of thoughtfulness and detachment. Clara, a short, robust woman with a kind face and hands gnarled from years of work, found her an hour later. She gave Sarah a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome to the Blackwood, miss. Mr. Thorne said you might be hungry." Sarah, unused to such simple kindness, felt a rush of emotion. "Thank you, Clara. He's a good man, for all the fuss the townsfolk make," Clara said, her voice low. "Don't you pay no mind to the stories." Sarah didn't know what to make of that. A good man. The man who had bought her like a horse. She followed Clara to the dining room. It was another large, spare room dominated by a long wooden table. A few of the ranch hands were already there, eating in a quiet, focused manner. They glanced at Sarah, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and stoic acceptance. Jedediah sat at the head of the table, a silent presence. The meal was simple but plentiful: stew, fresh bread, and coffee. Sarah ate slowly, hyper-aware of Jedediah's presence at the other end of the table. He didn't speak to her, or to anyone, really. He simply ate, his movements precise and economical. He was a man of action, not words. The silence was not awkward. It was simply the way of things here. After the meal, as the ranch hands dispersed, Jedediah finally spoke to her again. "Tomorrow, you'll meet the rest of the crew. We start early around here. I expect you'll get your bearings quickly enough." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Jedediah," he corrected, his voice flat. "There's no need for sir. We're to be married." The word married hung in the air between them, a cold, hard fact. Sarah felt a new wave of fear wash over her. It was one thing to be bought, another to be owned. She had a week until the formal ceremony, a week to prepare herself for a life she did not choose, with a man she did not know. But in that brief, silent dinner, she had learned one thing. Jedediah Thorne was not the monster of the stories. He was something far more complex and perhaps far more dangerous. He was a man with secrets, and she was about to be a part of his world, whether she liked it or not. The first few days at the Blackwood were a blur of new experiences. Sarah, despite her fear, found herself drawn into the rhythm of ranch life. She woke with the sun, ate with the men, and spent her days helping Clara with the household chores. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was a physical exertion that silenced the turmoil in her mind. Jedediah remained a distant, silent figure. He was always there, a powerful presence at the edge of her vision, but he rarely spoke to her. He was a man of the land, riding out with his men at dawn and returning at dusk, his face streaked with dust and sweat. She watched him from a distance, observing his interactions with his men. He was demanding but fair, quick to praise a good job and equally quick to give a firm, concise order. They respected him, she saw, a deep, earned respect that had nothing to do with fear. One afternoon, a torrential thunderstorm broke over the ranch, trapping everyone indoors. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the rain came down in sheets, drumming a furious rhythm on the tin roof of the bunkhouse. Sarah found herself in the main house, helping Clara sort through old clothes. Jedediah was in his study, a room she had yet to see. The door was ajar, and she could hear the low murmur of his voice. Curiosity, a dangerous thing, got the better of her. She crept closer, peering inside. He was standing by his desk, holding a small, framed photograph. The sight was startling. This stone-faced man, this giant, held a small, delicate picture with a gentleness that was completely at odds with his public persona. She couldn't see the picture from her vantage point, but she saw his face. For the first time, the mask of indifference was gone. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, were filled with a profound sadness. He ran a thumb over the glass of the frame, a gesture of deep, abiding love and loss. It was a look Sarah recognized from her own moments of grief, a look that spoke of an absence that could never be filled. A gust of wind slammed the door shut, and the sound startled her. She moved back quickly, but not before Jedediah looked up, his expression hardening instantly. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. She had trespassed on a private moment, on a pain he kept carefully hidden. He placed the photograph back in a drawer and closed it, the click of the wood like a lock snapping into place. That evening, during dinner, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a comfortable, natural silence. It was strained, charged with the unspoken tension of her discovery. He didn't look at her, and she kept her eyes on her plate, her mind racing. Who was in that photograph? A mother? A sister? A wife? The thought of a deceased wife was a sharp, unexpected pang. It was a ghost she had not anticipated, a rival in a relationship that wasn't even real. Later that night, as she lay in bed, the storm still raging outside, she found herself thinking not of her own misery, but of his. What could have caused such deep sorrow? Was the ruthlessness of his reputation a shield, a fortress he had built to protect himself from the world? She found herself wanting to know more, wanting to understand the man behind the myth. The next morning the sun rose, the world was fresh and clean after the rain. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Sarah, with a new sense of purpose, went about her chores. She saw Jedediah riding out with his men, and for the first time she waved. It was a small, hesitant gesture, but it was a beginning. He didn't wave back, but she saw him turn in his saddle. His eyes from a distance seemed to linger on her for just a moment before he was gone. She was no longer just a pawn in his game. She was a person, a woman who had seen a glimpse of his soul, a vulnerability he desperately tried to hide. And in that glimpse, the seeds of a different kind of story, a story of genuine connection, had been planted. She had been sold, yes, but perhaps in this cold, empty house she could find a home, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could help heal a man who was as broken as she was. Days bled into a week, and the week brought the day of the wedding. It was not a grand affair. The local preacher, a stoic, weathered man named Reverend Elias, was the only guest apart from Clara and a few of Jedediah's most trusted men. The ceremony took place in the main room of the house, the light filtering through the dust motes in the air, creating a soft, ethereal glow. Sarah wore one of the new dresses Jedediah had provided, a simple cream-colored linen. It was practical and unadorned, a reflection of the man she was to marry. Jedediah stood before her, a mountain in his dark suit. His face was unreadable. He did not smile. He did not look at her with affection. He simply stood there, a silent, powerful presence. Reverend Elias's words were a blur to Sarah. "Do you, Jedediah, take this woman? Do you, Sarah, take this man?" Her "I do" was a whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. Jedediah's was a low, firm word that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. When the ceremony was over, Jedediah took her hand. It was a large, calloused hand, and his grip was firm and sure. He placed a simple silver band on her finger, and for a fleeting second, his thumb brushed her skin. The touch was like a spark, a jolt of pure energy that traveled up her arm and made her heart beat a frantic rhythm. He pulled his hand away just as quickly, and the moment was gone. The post-wedding celebration was a simple dinner with the men. The atmosphere was subdued but respectful. The ranch hands toasted their boss and his new wife, their eyes holding a quiet curiosity. Sarah, sitting at the long table, felt a strange sense of belonging. This was her new life. This was her new family. A family she hadn't chosen, but one that was now hers. After dinner, Jedediah led her to the master bedroom. It was a large room, with a bed that was big enough for a whole family. Her stomach clenched with a familiar fear. She was a possession, a woman who had been bought. This was the moment she had been dreading. He closed the door behind them, and the click of the latch echoed in the silence. He stood by the fireplace, his back to her. "You will be safe here, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet. "You will have a home, and no one will ever harm you again." She didn't know how to respond. The words were a promise, a vow, but they felt like they were from a stranger. He finally turned to face her. "I know why your father did what he did. I know the kind of life you've led." He paused, his gaze soft, almost apologetic. "I am not your jailer, Sarah. You are free to do as you please on this ranch. This house is yours. This room, it is also yours." He gestured to the other side of the room. A large, worn-looking armchair sat in a corner. "I will sleep there." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't going to touch her. The relief was so overwhelming, it made her legs feel weak. He wasn't a monster. He was a man of honor, a man who saw her for who she was, not just a tool to satisfy his needs. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice thick with emotion. He looked away, his face a grim mask once again. "My intentions were not what your father believed them to be," he said, the words a low rumble. "I saw your father's debt. I saw the people he owed. I saw what would happen to you. I couldn't let it happen." He finally looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. The sadness she had seen in the study was back, a deep, abiding sorrow that seemed to reach from his past and touch her. "This marriage, it was the only way to save you, to make sure you were under my protection, the only way to pay the debt without shaming you." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. He hadn't bought her. He had saved her. He had sacrificed his reputation, the rumors of his ruthlessness, to give her a life, a home. He had paid her father's debt with his own honor. The realization was a staggering blow, a truth so simple and so profound it took her breath away. You did this for me," she whispered. He didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a complicated mix of longing and resignation. The silence was an unspoken accord, a promise that their marriage would not be one of ownership, but of protection. He was her guardian, her protector, and for the first time since her father sold her, Sarah felt a profound sense of safety. She was not a possession. She was home. Sarah settled into a comfortable routine at the Blackwood. She helped Clara with chores and found herself befriending the quiet ranch hand, Silas, who patiently taught her to ride. Her closest confidant, however, became Clara, who had been with Jedediah for years. One afternoon, Clara revealed a shocking truth. Jedediah had known of Sarah long before she arrived. He had watched her from afar in town, silently admiring her strength and determination. Clara then told her about Jedediah's tragic past, the fire that took his wife, Alice, and their daughter Lillian, a decade ago. It was a loss that had hardened him and made him retreat from the world. That evening, Sarah found Jedediah on the porch. She sat beside him and spoke softly of his past. He admitted his guilt, believing the fire was his fault because he wasn't there to save them. Sarah, seeing his profound pain, took his hand. "It wasn't your fault, Jedediah," she said. "Grief doesn't have a timeline." He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her empathy. In that moment, the fortress around his heart cracked, allowing a new kind of connection to form. The fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of Jedediah's rival, Jonathan Vance. Vance, a ruthless land grabber, taunted Jedediah, revealing he knew about the debt and the arranged marriage. He hinted at a more sinister truth, that Sarah's father had been involved with dangerous men who viewed Sarah as a commodity to settle his debts. Vance's words confirmed Jedediah's deepest fears. He had known about the dangerous people her father owed and had paid the debt to save her from a far worse fate. Jedediah's controlled rage turned into a fierce protective instinct. He warned Vance to leave and never return. With the threat now out in the open, Jedediah increased security at the ranch. Amidst the rising tension, a new layer of trust and respect formed between Sarah and Jedediah. She was no longer just his wife, but his confidant and partner in this fight. The day was bright, but a storm was brewing. Sarah's father, Thomas, returned, his new clothes and false confidence hiding his true motive. He claimed to have won money to repay Jedediah, but quickly revealed his real plan, to demand a share of Jedediah's wealth and use Sarah as leverage. He had returned with a group of menacing men, the very men who had threatened Sarah before Jedediah intervened. Thomas, gloating, told Jedediah he could never truly be free of him or his dangerous associates. Jedediah, his face a mask of grim determination, pulled his pistol, ready to defend his land and his wife. He swore he would protect Sarah, no matter the cost. His vow was a promise forged in the heat of battle, a declaration of a different kind of love, a love built on protection, respect, and a shared purpose. Sarah, no longer a pawn, felt a fierce pride as she stood beside him, ready to fight for her new life. The confrontation with her father left a deep unease. Jedediah, a man of action, prepared the ranch for a siege, turning the peaceful homestead into a fortress. He called his men together, and Sarah, unwilling to stand by, took on the role of a silent guardian, cooking and mending for the men. One evening, Jedediah found her in the kitchen, exhausted. He offered her a chance to leave, to escape the danger, but Sarah refused. "This is my home, Jedediah," she said. "This is my fight." She confessed that he hadn't just saved her from her father, but from a life of fear. She told him she loved him. Jedediah, his stoic facade finally breaking, cupped her face in his hands. He confessed that he had loved her from afar since he first saw her. He had been terrified to have something to lose again, but now realized he couldn't live without her. Their kiss was not one of passion, but of a deep, abiding love, forged in shared pain and mutual respect. The final attack came at dawn. A volley of rifle fire shattered the morning's quiet, and the Blackwood became a battlefield. Jedediah's men fought fiercely, but the overwhelming numbers of Vance and Thomas's men began to take their toll. From the main house, Sarah watched, a rifle in her hands, her heart pounding. She saw Jedediah fall, a bullet grazing his arm, and saw Vance charge forward, his rifle raised for a final fatal shot. Sarah, driven by a fierce resolve, took aim. She had one shot, one chance. The thunderous roar of the rifle echoed as she pulled the trigger. Vance fell from his horse, his shoulder bleeding. The sight of their leader wounded broke the attackers' resolve, and they fled. The battle was over. Jedediah walked toward her, and in his eyes she saw not just pride, but a profound sense of awe. "You saved me," he said. He had been the one to save her, but in the end, she had been the one to save him. In the weeks that followed, the Blackwood healed. The wounds, both physical and emotional, began to mend. The ranch, once a fortress, became a true home. With Sarah by his side, Jedediah's sadness lifted, replaced by a quiet contentment. They were partners in every sense of the word, running the ranch together and sharing a future they had fought for. One evening, they sat on the porch, their hands intertwined, watching the sunset. Sarah told him he had saved her, but he in turn said she had brought him back to life. Their story was not a fairy tale, but a testament to love forged in hardship. It was a story of two broken people who, with the support of each other and their new family, built a life from the ashes of their pasts. They had found their happily ever after, not in a gilded cage, but in the heart of the Blackwood Ranch, a place they had built together and finally called home.